The wind whipped through the dry grass of the plains, rustling the wheat stalks and sending a cloud of dust up into the air. The sun hung low over Blackwell Ranch, a deep, burning red, casting long shadows across the dirt yard. Josiah Blackwell's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the front porch, the familiar sound of his footsteps the only thing that broke the silence. His daughter, barely more than a child, followed him closely, her hand grasping the back of his coat like she was afraid to let go. It wasn't the first time Josiah had come to offer help. He had done it for others in the past, swinging a hammer, mending a fence, or digging a well. But something about this place felt different. This wasn't just another farm. This was Blackwell Ranch, where every rock and tree seemed to remember the pain that had been buried here. And now, with his own past haunting his every step, Josiah couldn't help but wonder if he'd find the same kind of solace here. He stopped at the door, knocked once, and then again, a little harder this time. The sound echoed into the quiet, breaking the stillness. There was a pause before the door creaked open, revealing the widow. Her face was weathered, her eyes shadowed with grief, but there was something in her stance that made Josiah hesitate. The widow's eyes lingered on him for a moment, her gaze steady, but then they drifted past him, straight to his daughter standing behind him, clutching the hem of his coat. The air seemed to thicken as she studied the girl, her expression unreadable. Josiah felt the weight of her silence pressing in on him, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to say next. "Can I help you?" the widow finally asked, her voice rough but calm. Josiah cleared his throat. "I'm Josiah Blackwell. I've come to offer my help. I'm a rancher, if you need any work done around here. Fences, barns, anything you might need." The widow didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, eyes still locked on Josiah's daughter. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Josiah shifted his weight from one foot to the other, uncomfortable with the silence that stretched on between them. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. Josiah looked over his shoulder at his daughter, who stood quietly, her small frame lost in the shadow of his larger one. She was a silent child, a girl who had learned to be strong in a world that hadn't been kind. He knew she didn't mind the quiet, but something about the widow's gaze made Josiah want to shield her, even though he didn't know why. Finally, the widow spoke, her voice soft but direct. "You're not from around here?" Josiah nodded. "No, ma'am. Just passing through. I've got a little ranch of my own a few miles north. Thought you might need a hand." The widow's eyes flicked back to the girl behind him, and Josiah felt a tightening in his chest. There was something in her look that made him uneasy, something unspoken, but powerful. "I'm not sure what help I need," the widow said after a long pause. "But I can't turn down a rancher's offer. Not these days." Josiah nodded again, unsure of what to say next. He had no idea what was weighing on the widow's heart, but he knew grief when he saw it. He had carried it himself for too many years to count. The loss of his wife, the life they had built together, all gone in a flash. "Understand," Josiah said finally, his voice quieter. "It's hard, I know." The widow's gaze softened, just slightly. She stepped back from the door, a silent invitation for him to come in. Josiah hesitated for a moment, glancing at his daughter, but she gave him a small nod, as if reassuring him that it was all right. They walked inside, the door creaking shut behind them. The house was dark, the heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The faint smell of dust and old wood lingered in the air. The widow moved slowly, almost as if the house was a place she wasn't sure she wanted to be in anymore. "Do you have a place to stay?" the widow asked as she led them into the small kitchen. She gestured for them to sit at the table, her hand still trembling slightly as she cleared a spot. Josiah lowered himself into a chair, his daughter following suit. "We were planning to camp out by the creek for the night," Josiah said. "But if you're willing to take us in, we'd be grateful." The widow nodded, her lips pressed tight together. You can stay for a night or two. It's the least I can offer." Josiah looked over at his daughter, who was already eyeing the bread and cheese on the table. The hunger in her eyes was evident, but she said nothing. The quiet bond between father and daughter was something that needed no words. "Thank you," Josiah said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't sure what else to say, what else there was to say. So he simply nodded and accepted the peace offering, knowing full well that the road ahead would be far from easy for any of them. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as Josiah settled at the kitchen table, his daughter still standing beside him, glancing nervously at the widow. The house was small, sparsely furnished, with old wooden beams that creaked in the quiet. A single oil lamp flickered dimly in the corner, casting long shadows on the cracked plaster walls. There were remnants of a life that had once been full, but now the house seemed like a hollow shell, abandoned to the weight of grief. The widow stood by the stove, her back to Josiah and his daughter. Her hands, worn and weathered from years of hard work, moved mechanically as she heated water on the stove. The clink of the kettle was the only sound breaking the stillness. Josiah noticed how her movements seemed deliberate, like someone who was afraid that if she moved too quickly, everything might fall apart. He couldn't quite place it, but something about her felt untethered, like she was on the verge of floating away from the world altogether. The grief she carried seemed to hang around her like a fog, impenetrable and heavy. The room seemed to shrink as he watched her. He hadn't expected to find someone so closed off, so unwilling to let anyone in. She had offered him the chance to stay for a night or two, but there was an air of reluctance in her offer, a hesitation that lingered long after she had spoken. Josiah knew grief well. He had felt it eating at him for years now, gnawing away at his heart until he'd become nothing more than a shell of the man he used to be. But this woman, this widow, had a different kind of sorrow, one that she seemed determined to keep buried, locked away in the deepest corners of her heart. He looked over at his daughter, who was still standing beside him. She had her arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes cast downward, avoiding the widow's gaze. Josiah could feel the tension between them. It was subtle, but it was there, the unspoken understanding that something was happening beneath the surface. His daughter, though only a child, seemed to understand this woman's grief on some deeper level. She sensed it in the same way that Josiah did, a quiet ache that filled the room and left no space for anything else. The widow turned around, her movements slow and deliberate. She finally looked up at Josiah, her eyes narrow and guarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them like an old wound that had never healed. "What happened to you?" the widow asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a simple question, but it carried with it a weight that Josiah hadn't been prepared for. He wasn't sure how to answer. How could he put into words the loss that had been eating away at him for so long? How could he explain the emptiness he felt, the hollow ache that had become a permanent part of his soul? "It's been a long road," he said finally, his voice rough, the words coming out slower than he intended. "My wife passed a few years ago. The ranch, it's just me and my daughter now." The widow nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask for details, didn't press him for more information. But Josiah could see that she was waiting for something, waiting for him to offer her something more than just the bare facts. "I'm sorry," she said after a long pause, her eyes softening for just a moment. "I didn't mean to pry." Josiah shook his head. "No, it's all right," he said, though the words felt empty, like they didn't mean anything at all. The widow's gaze drifted toward his daughter, who was still standing quietly at his side. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Josiah couldn't help but notice the way his daughter seemed to recoil under the widow's stare. It was almost as if she could sense the widow's pain, could feel the weight of it pressing in on her, and she didn't know how to deal with it. The widow's expression faltered for a brief moment, as if she'd seen something in his daughter that she hadn't expected. But before Josiah could say anything, the widow turned away, walking toward the small pantry near the back of the kitchen. Josiah sat there, unsure of what to say next. He could feel the tension growing in the room, thickening with each passing second. His daughter shifted uneasily at his side, and he put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Is there anything you need?" Josiah asked, his voice breaking the silence that had settled over them. The widow didn't answer right away. Instead, she busied herself with pulling a loaf of stale bread from the pantry and slicing it with a sharp knife. Her movements were methodical, almost mechanical, as if she was trying to distract herself from the uncomfortable quiet between them. "I'm fine," she said, her voice distant, almost absent. "I've learned to get by. It's just, sometimes it feels like nothing ever changes." Josiah nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. He had felt that way, too, like everything around him was stuck in place, frozen in time. But deep down, he knew that change was inevitable, even if it took years to happen. The widow placed the bread on the table, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up at Josiah again, her gaze heavy, as if she was weighing something inside her. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice still soft, but now with an edge of something more, something raw. "What do you want from me?" Josiah felt his heart tighten at the question. He wasn't sure how to answer. What did he want from her? He had come here to offer help. Yes, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he had hoped for something more. Maybe he had hoped that this woman, who carried so much pain, might offer him something in return, a way to fill the emptiness that had been growing inside him for so long. "I'm just looking for a place to start over," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't expect anything from you. Just a chance." The widow's eyes softened again, but there was still a wariness in her gaze. She nodded slowly, as if processing his words. "I'll let you stay for a few days," she said finally, her voice steady. "But you have to understand, this is just temporary. I don't have much to offer." Josiah nodded, grateful for the opportunity, but knowing that the real work had only just begun. The silence between them stretched out again, but this time it wasn't as suffocating. There was a flicker of something like hope, just beneath the surface. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the kitchen as Josiah leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs beneath the table. His daughter sat quietly beside him, her fingers tapping gently on the edge of her glass. The widow, who had only introduced herself as Sarah, moved around the room, busying herself with the small tasks that seemed to define her days. There was a quiet rhythm to her actions, but it was more mechanical than peaceful, like someone moving through a routine they hadn't chosen, but had come to accept. Josiah had come to the ranch hoping for more than just work, but as the silence stretched between them, he realized that wasn't going to be so easy. He could sense that Sarah was someone who had built walls so high that even the most persistent of knockers would find it nearly impossible to break through. And yet, here he was offering something that wasn't just work, but a promise. A chance to start again for him and his daughter. Maybe even for her, though he wasn't sure she knew that yet. "I'm not asking for much," Josiah said finally, breaking the quiet that had settled over the table. "Just a place to rest our heads, help with the land until I can get things up and running again. My wife's passing left a lot of things undone. I'm trying to make it right." Sarah paused at the sink, her back to him, her shoulders stiff. There was no immediate response, just the faint clinking of her washing the dishes, as if the task was more important than the conversation. Josiah's fingers drummed lightly on the table, the only other sound in the room. "I don't need you to explain yourself," Sarah said quietly, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite read. "I've heard the stories." Josiah was taken aback for a moment. He'd expected her to ask about his wife or the ranch. He hadn't expected her to already know something about him, to know something about the weight he carried. Stories, he asked, his voice flat. People talk, she replied, not turning to face him, but continuing her work. Small towns, they have a way of doing that. Josiah shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the turn in the conversation. He hadn't come here for gossip. He'd come to offer his help, not his history. I don't care about rumors, he said after a pause, his tone steady but firm. I'm here to work. That's all I want. Sarah's shoulders tightened, but she didn't respond right away. Josiah glanced at his daughter, who sat quietly watching the back and forth, her wide eyes flicking from him to Sarah. He could tell she was trying to make sense of the situation, the same way he was. But for now, there was nothing to say, so they sat in that quiet space. Neither of them fully comfortable, but all too aware of the tension that swirled around them. Finally, Sarah turned to face him, wiping her hands on the apron tied around her waist. She met his gaze for the first time since they'd sat down, and for a moment, Josiah thought he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Was it curiosity or something more? He wasn't sure. "You said you've got a ranch?" she asked, her voice softer now. "How big is it?" Josiah nodded. "It's small, about 100 acres, just enough to keep me busy. Not much to offer a lot of people, but it's mine. Or at least it was before." Her eyes narrowed slightly as she considered his words. Before what? Josiah hesitated, wondering how much to reveal. This wasn't about sharing every painful detail of his life, but he could tell Sarah wasn't going to let him get away with avoiding the question. Not that he minded. There was something about her directness that made him feel like she saw through all the layers he had built around himself. And maybe that was what had drawn him here in the first place, a feeling that, in some strange way, she understood loss. "My wife died," he said simply, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "She died, and with her, everything that came with that life. I'm just trying to pick up the pieces." Sarah's expression softened, just a little, but it was enough for Josiah to feel the change. There was no pity in her gaze, no judgment, just an acknowledgement that she understood, even if it wasn't something either of them spoke aloud. "I don't mean to make you relive all that," Sarah said after a moment, her voice quiet. "It's just that I've got my own kind of grief, a kind that doesn't always show." Josiah nodded, his lips tight. "I know the kind of grief that doesn't show. You carry it, but no one else knows. You learn to keep it tucked away until you can't anymore." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside and the faint hum of the stove. Then, Sarah took a step forward, her shoulders relaxed. Her gaze moved to Josiah's daughter again, and for the first time since he had arrived, she seemed to truly see them both. "Help isn't something I give lightly," Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But I've got no choice but to let you stay. I've been running this ranch alone for too long." Josiah's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching for a moment. He had expected her to turn him away, to send him off, but here she was, offering him the chance to stay. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You won't regret it," he said, his voice low but sincere. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him for a moment, and then she nodded. "We'll see." She turned back to the stove, her movements more fluid now, less stiff than before. Josiah wasn't sure what to say next. The unspoken agreement between them hung in the air like a delicate thread, one that neither of them was willing to break just yet. He understood that Sarah wasn't ready to fully open up to him, but this was a start. The door creaked open behind him, and Josiah's daughter stepped out of the room, her small footsteps light on the floor. She walked toward the back door, pausing just before she reached it. "I'm going to see if the horses are all right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Josiah watched her go, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. She was quieter than most kids, but there was something about the way she moved, something steady and sure, that gave him comfort. Sarah, too, looked toward the door as the girl disappeared outside, her expression unreadable. "She's a good girl," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a hint of something Josiah couldn't quite place. "Strong." Josiah's smile deepened, and he nodded. She is. They both stood there for a moment, watching the door where his daughter had disappeared, neither of them knowing quite how to bridge the gap that still lay between them. The days passed slowly, the kind of days that feel like they stretch on forever, but never really move. Josiah woke early, like he always did, and went about his work in a quiet, measured rhythm. The ranch was in need of a lot of attention. Broken fences, a leaky roof, a barn that looked like it could collapse at any moment. But he worked quietly and without complaint. He knew it was a long road ahead, but it wasn't the kind of work that broke a man. It was the kind of work that brought him peace. And right now, peace was something he desperately needed. His daughter, as usual, was by his side, learning the ropes of ranch life. She wasn't the loud, energetic kind of child, but she had a quiet strength that made Josiah proud. The way she carried herself was different from most children her age. There was a calmness in her that came from a life full of hardships, a life she was still trying to understand, just like him. As the days went by, Josiah noticed the subtle shifts in the household. Sarah, though still distant, had begun to loosen up just a little. Her movements had become less rigid, her words more often than not tinged with a kind of weary acceptance. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it was a small, fleeting thing, like a fragile bloom fighting its way through the cold. Josiah didn't push her for conversation. He didn't want to rush anything. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but it wasn't easy either. There were times when they exchanged glances, when their eyes met over the dinner table or across the yard, and for a brief moment, it felt like they understood each other without saying a word. A shared understanding, forged in the fires of loss. But then, there were moments when the silence was too thick, when the air felt so heavy that it made his chest tighten. Sarah would look at him as if measuring him, as if she was deciding whether or not she could trust him. It was like she was waiting for him to prove something, though he didn't know what. And in those moments, Josiah would look away, back to the work at hand, because sometimes it was easier to focus on the simple things, the tasks he could control, than to face the unspoken questions hanging in the air. It was on one of these days that Josiah caught sight of his daughter and Sarah's daughter, Millie, talking by the barn. The two girls had become inseparable over the past week, their quiet companionship growing as they worked together, feeding the horses and mending the garden fence. Josiah watched them from the porch, the wind blowing through his hair, and something in his chest tightened. Millie, who had been so reserved when they first arrived, was beginning to open up in ways Josiah hadn't expected. He didn't know if it was the work, the routine, or just the time they spent together, but she was different now. More alive, somehow. Her movements were more sure, her gaze less distant. And as for Sarah, she had become more watchful. Josiah could feel it, a sense that she was constantly observing, not just him, but everything around her. It wasn't that she was trying to be secretive, but there was a quiet tension in the way she held herself. It was like she was afraid to let go, afraid to trust. "Josiah," Sarah called from the doorway, snapping him out of his thoughts. He turned to face her, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked. It was one of those moments where it felt like the entire world fell away, where the air between them was charged with something that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. "Could you come help me with the fence?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was something in the way she said it, something that made his heart skip a beat. It was the first time she had asked for his help with something other than the daily chores. Josiah nodded, wiping his hands on his pants before walking toward her. Of course. As they walked to the edge of the property, Josiah couldn't help but notice the way Sarah moved beside him. She was no longer walking stiffly, but with a kind of fluid grace. Her shoulders weren't as tense, and for the first time, she didn't seem like she was carrying the weight of the world on her back. They worked together in silence, fixing the broken fence and reinforcing the posts. Josiah was careful with his movements, making sure everything was secure, but also giving Sarah the space she seemed to need. There were moments when their hands brushed together, And though neither of them said anything, the touch lingered in the air, electric and unspoken. It was a quiet intimacy, something that wasn't about words or promises, but about presence, the kind of thing that only came with time. "Your daughter," Sarah said after a while, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "She's different." Josiah stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. "Different how?" Sarah glanced at him, her eyes flicking over to where Millie was working with his daughter, their heads bent low as they pulled weeds from the garden. "She doesn't talk much, does she?" Josiah shook his head, his gaze softening as he looked at his daughter. "No, she doesn't. She's always been quiet." Sarah nodded, her eyes lingering on the two girls. "It's not easy, is it? Losing someone." Josiah's breath hitched in his chest. The way she said it, the way her words seemed to hang in the air like they carried more weight than just a simple observation. He hadn't expected her to open up, hadn't expected her to show even this much vulnerability. "It never really gets easier," he said quietly, the words coming out like a confession. "But it gets quieter, and you learn to live with it." Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, she nodded slowly, as if understanding something that had been unsaid for a long time. "Yeah," she said softly. "I know." The wind picked up again, the sound of it rustling the tall grass and causing the trees to sway. It was a sound Josiah had grown used to, a sound that was comforting in its own way. It was the sound of a land that had seen so much pain and so much life, and yet it still stood, still breathed. The two of them stood there for a long moment, side by side, not saying anything, just working, just being. The days stretched on, and though the work at the ranch didn't get any easier, Josiah had started to feel something he hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. The kind of belonging that crept up on you when you weren't looking, like the slow warmth of the sun as it sank behind the hills, covering everything in a soft glow. There was a comfort in the quiet, a rhythm to the tasks that made everything feel right, or at least as right as it could be. Sarah had started to soften just a little. There were moments now when she didn't look through him, when her eyes met his, and they didn't linger with a weight of unspoken words. The awkwardness between them was still there, but it was no longer as heavy. Maybe it was the work, maybe it was time, but whatever it was, Josiah could sense the change. And it was in these quiet moments, when they worked side by side, or when Sarah asked him for help with the smallest things, that he began to feel like he wasn't just a guest in her home anymore. Maybe he wasn't part of her family, but for the first time, it felt like there was space for him here. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, Josiah and Sarah stood side by side in the barn, the air thick with the scent of hay and leather. They had just finished fixing the roof, and now they were securing the last of the loose boards. The work was hard, but Josiah was used to it. It was the kind of work he understood. Physical, honest, something that didn't require a lot of words. But as they worked, Josiah couldn't help but notice Sarah's glances, brief and hesitant, as if she was trying to gauge something, trying to make up her mind. The thought had crossed his mind more than once, but it wasn't until today, in the quiet of the barn with the horses munching hay in the stalls, that he realized something had shifted. "You know," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "I've been thinking." Josiah stopped what he was doing, looking over at her. She was leaning against a post, her arms crossed, her expression thoughtful. There was a tension in her face, like she was weighing something carefully, deciding whether or not to share it. "What about?" he asked, his voice tentative. He wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but it felt like it was important. Sarah hesitated for a moment before she spoke, her eyes not meeting his. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, as if she was still unsure of what exactly she was trying to say. Josiah raised an eyebrow, trying to gauge the meaning behind her words. "How's that?" She finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a long while. "I thought you'd be like the others," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "Just passing through, offering help for a day or two, never staying. I didn't think you'd stick around." Josiah was quiet for a moment, considering her words. It was true. He hadn't expected to stay here forever. He had hoped for a fresh start, for a chance to rebuild, but he hadn't known what he was getting into when he'd arrived. Still, there was something about this place, about her and Millie, that made him want to try. Something in him wanted to stay. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply, though he wasn't sure why he was making such a bold statement. Maybe it was because he'd come to realize, after all these years, that sometimes the things you were looking for weren't always the things you planned. They didn't always show up how you expected them to. Sarah studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. "You really mean that?" she asked, her voice almost fragile. Josiah nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the barn was the faint rustling of the horses, the soft creak of the wooden beams as they settled. Josiah wasn't sure if he was waiting for her to say something else, or if he was just waiting for the moment to pass. But he felt like something important was happening, something that couldn't be undone. Finally, Sarah broke the silence again, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with all of this," she said, gesturing vaguely to the barn, to the ranch, to the work they had to do. "It's a lot to manage on my own. And I'm not good at asking for help." Josiah's heart softened at the vulnerability in her words. He could hear the weight in her voice, the exhaustion of carrying everything on her own for so long. He knew that feeling well, the burden of responsibility that never seemed to lift, no matter how much you carried. "You don't have to ask," Josiah said gently. "I'm here. I can help." She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to decide if she could trust him with this, with everything. And then, after a long pause, she spoke again, her voice steady. "I'm offering you something," she said. "A place here. Not just for now, but I need someone who can help me with the land. I can't do it alone anymore." Josiah felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't sure what she was asking, but he could feel the weight of her words. This wasn't just about ranch work. This was about trust. This was about letting someone in when you'd spent so long keeping the world at arm's length. "You want me to stay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded slowly, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes still there, but now softened by something else. "Yes, but not just for you. For your daughter, too." Josiah was silent, processing her words. It wasn't an easy thing to offer, he knew that. She was giving him more than just a place to stay. She was offering him a chance to belong, to rebuild, to start again. And for the first time since he'd lost his wife, Josiah felt like he was standing on the edge of something real. Something that wasn't just survival, but living. "I won't let you down," he said, his voice firm with resolve. Sarah gave him a small, tentative smile, the kind of smile that spoke more than words ever could. "We'll see," she replied softly, but Josiah could hear the unspoken hope in her voice. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Josiah allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future. Not just for himself, but for his daughter, and maybe, just maybe for Sarah and Millie too. The sun rose higher each day, casting the ranch in a gentle warmth that turned the world into a quiet, golden blur. The days flowed like the steady rhythm of the creek that ran behind the barn, each one blending into the next with a calmness that was both new and familiar. Josiah worked hard, as always, but now there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the tasks that kept him busy, it was the people around him. The silent understanding between him and Sarah had begun to solidify, and he could see it in the way she moved around the ranch, a little less tense, a little more at ease. It was a fragile kind of peace, but it was real. Sarah didn't need to say much for Josiah to know how grateful she was for his help. The little things, the way she would glance at him when she needed something done, or how she started to trust him with more of the work, spoke volumes. Josiah didn't push her. He didn't have to. It was clear that she was coming to terms with the idea that she didn't have to do everything on her own anymore. She didn't have to carry the weight of the ranch by herself. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of her grief alone either. Josiah's daughter, too, had begun to change. At first, she had kept to herself, speaking only when spoken to. But now, there were moments when she would laugh, a soft, shy sound that seemed to surprise even her. The quiet bond between her and Millie had only grown stronger. They worked together, feeding the horses, collecting eggs, and learning the small tasks that would eventually become second nature to them. Josiah had noticed that Millie no longer seemed so distant. Her once guarded eyes had started to soften, and she had even begun to smile at his daughter, something Josiah hadn't expected so soon. One afternoon, as the girls played outside, Josiah watched them from the porch. His daughter and Millie were chasing each other through the garden, their laughter rising in the warm air like birdsong. It was a beautiful sight, one that he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. It was a sign that life was moving forward. For all the loss, all the grief, there was still life to be lived, and there was still room for happiness. He felt Sarah beside him before he saw her. She had come out of the barn and stood quietly at the edge of the porch, looking out over the land with her arms folded across her chest. Her gaze softened as she watched the girls, but there was a wariness in her eyes, as if she didn't quite believe in this peace yet. "They're good together," Josiah said, his voice soft, almost as if speaking to himself. Sarah nodded, her gaze never leaving the girls. "Yeah, they're different. They're not the same as they were when you first arrived." Josiah smiled. "Neither are we." Sarah didn't respond right away, but Josiah could sense the shift in her. She hadn't said much about her past, and he wasn't pushing her to, but something in the way she watched the girls, something in her quiet acceptance of the life they were building, told him that she was beginning to heal in ways she hadn't expected. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There didn't seem to be any need for words. They just stood there together, two people who had been through things they weren't ready to talk about, but who understood the weight of each other's silence. There was a connection between them now, a fragile bond that had been built on the work they'd shared and the unspoken understanding that they were both looking for something more. Millie had grown stronger in more ways than one. Josiah noticed the way she walked a little taller, the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence. She still had a long way to go, but it was clear that she was finding her place in this world, even if she hadn't yet found her place in the town. And Josiah understood that better than anyone. The world could be a harsh place, especially when you didn't fit the mold. But he could see that Millie was starting to believe that she belonged here, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Josiah couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. It was the first time in weeks that the house felt warm in a way that wasn't just from the fire and the hearth. There was a quiet comfort in the way they all sat together, the clink of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation filling the air. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without its awkward moments. But for the first time since he had arrived, Josiah felt like he wasn't just waiting for something to happen. Something had already happened. And it was in the moments like these, when everything felt ordinary, that he realized how much they had already come to mean to one another. "How's the garden coming along?" Sarah asked as she passed the bread. Josiah glanced at Millie, who had been quietly eating her dinner, her eyes still uncertain, but not as distant as they had been when they first met. "It's coming along fine," he said. "The plants are taking root. They'll be ready in a few weeks." Sarah nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Good," she said softly. "I'll need help with the harvest when it's time. Maybe you and Millie can help." Josiah smiled, a warmth spreading in his chest. "I'm sure we can." The girls exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them. Josiah saw the way they communicated without words, the way their bond had grown from something tentative into something solid. He could see it in the way Millie reached for his daughter's hand without hesitation, The way they shared a quiet laugh over a private joke only they understood. After dinner, as the night drew in, the four of them stepped outside to watch the stars. The air was cool, and the night sky stretched out above them, full of possibilities. Josiah's daughter leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they both looked up at the twinkling stars. Millie stood off to the side, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if contemplating the future that lay ahead. And Sarah, standing beside him, didn't say anything, but Josiah could feel her presence, feel the unspoken bond that had formed between them over the last few days. In that moment, it was as though the land itself had finally forgiven them for their losses, for their pain. There was a newness to the air, a fresh start that hung between them, like the promise of rain after a long drought. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. The first heavy rainstorm of the season arrived one evening, with the sound of thunder rolling across the hills, rattling the windows of the small ranch house. Josiah stood at the window, watching the storm lash against the land. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain hit the roof in a steady, rhythmic patter. It was a wild, beautiful thing, and Josiah felt a deep sense of peace watching it. The storm was a reminder of nature's power, its unpredictability, and its ability to cleanse and renew. It was the kind of storm that washed away old wounds, leaving only the promise of something fresh. As the night deepened, the storm didn't show any signs of letting up. Millie and his daughter had already gone to bed, exhausted from a day of hard work in the fields. Josiah and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea in the dim light. There was a quiet comfort in the room now, a sense of shared understanding between them. They weren't just strangers anymore. They had become something more, partners, survivors, and slowly, something that felt like family. "You ever think about what's next?" Sarah asked, her voice soft as she looked out the window, watching the rain cascade down. Josiah didn't have to think long. He knew the answer, even though he hadn't admitted it to himself until now. Every day, he said, his voice steady. "I think about the land, the work we've got ahead of us, and the future for me and my daughter. I think about the future for us all." Sarah turned to face him, her expression unreadable, but there was something different in her eyes now. Something open, something that hadn't been there before. "Do you want this?" she asked, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear her over the rain. Josiah blinked, a slight confusion rising in him, but he understood almost immediately. She wasn't just talking about the ranch. She wasn't just talking about work or survival. She was asking him something bigger, something deeper. She was asking if he wanted to stay, if he wanted a future here with her and Millie. He set down his cup, his hand steady as he looked into her eyes. The weight of her question settled on his shoulders, and he felt the weight of his own response, the truth he'd been holding back for so long. "I do," he said, his voice full of certainty. "I want this. With you. With Millie. With everything. I never thought I'd find something like this again. I never thought I could belong anywhere. But here, with you, with this land, it feels like I'm finally home." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. Then, slowly, she reached out across the table, her hand brushing against his. The touch was simple but grounding. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," she said softly, "but I know that today we have each other. And that's enough." Josiah's chest tightened, a flood of emotions rising in him. He had spent so many years carrying grief and regret, burying them deep inside, thinking he could never move past them. But this felt like the first real step forward in a long time. He had found something here, something that wasn't just about survival. It was about living. It was about hope, about the future, about finding joy in the small things, and the people who made those small moments worth it. Outside, the storm began to die down, the thunder fading into the distance. The sound of rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, the world outside calming. The earth had been washed clean, ready for something new to take root. "I think this is the start of something good," Josiah said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think you're right," Sarah said, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But it's going to take work. It's going to take time." "We've got time," Josiah replied. "And we've got each other." The next morning, the sun rose with a clarity Josiah hadn't seen in years. The storm had left the land glistening, fresh and vibrant. The air was clean, the sky wide and bright, and the whole ranch seemed to breathe with a new sense of possibility. Josiah stepped outside, taking in the beauty of the morning. The earth smelled rich and damp, and the birds had already begun to sing, filling the silence with their lively chatter. He found Sarah and Millie already outside, working together to gather the remnants of the storm. Millie was laughing, her hair wild and messy from the wind. Her face lit up with something Josiah hadn't seen before, a kind of lightness, a joy that hadn't been there when they first arrived. Sarah was watching her, her gaze soft, and when she looked up to meet Josiah's eyes, he saw something in her that he hadn't seen before either. A peace of contentment. She had let go of her fears, her doubts, and finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future. The girls were already at work, their hands moving quickly, their faces flushed with the excitement of a new day. There was a feeling of unity, of shared purpose. Josiah smiled to himself as he watched them, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't known he could feel. He hadn't just found a place here, he had found a family. He walked over to join them, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of belonging that reached deep into his bones. This was home. This was the life he had been searching for, and he didn't need anything else. As they worked together, laughter and conversation flowing freely between them, Josiah couldn't help but feel a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The ranch, the land, the future, they were all his now. But more than that, he had found something even more precious: love, trust, and the promise of a life built together, one day at a time. The storm had passed, and now, under the bright, open sky, they were free to build something new. And Josiah knew, with every fiber of his being, that this was only the beginning.